Great, thanks very much, Mark. Hi, everyone. My name's Damien Bird. I'm Publishing Director at CABI, and it's great to be here to introduce this panel discussion about how research and knowledge makes its way into the hands of policymakers and informs policy decisions. The goal of the session is to think about how the process or system works now, or maybe doesn't work, where the challenges might be and the blockers, if any, and then hopefully a discussion around some of the solutions or options open to us all along the chain, including researchers, publishers, librarians, policymakers, and possibly others. We're encouraged to keep the introductions very brief, so I will just very quickly say that we have an excellent panel here to discuss this. Hopefully the fourth panel member, oh, there she is. Gosh, Jaron, you're enormous. She's actually much smaller than that in real life, I promise. No, it's great to have you here, Jaron. Thanks very much. So on my left, we have Toby from Coherent Digital and formerly OECD, Louis from CILIP, and I'm not going to spell out what CILIP stands for because I've already forgotten, but it's the Library Association, and then Kath from the Institute for Government Academy. And then looking down on all of us, we have Jaron, who heads up the Evidence and Policy Programme at CABI and is also founding director of the Juno Evidence Alliance. So thanks to you all for coming. I do also want to say that we obviously have a room full of panelists as well in the form of you guys, so I will try and stop occasionally and regularly to ask for any questions, or if you just really want to disagree with Toby, which you're right up for that one. Good, so thank you very much. So to dive in, I guess, as I say, it'd be good to start with how this system works from your various perspectives at the moment. And I wonder, Toby, if I could hand to you first to kick us off.
Yeah, thank you. I thought I'd start off with a quote written by a guy called R2R in the Revue d'économie du développement. The article is in English. Several years ago, I carried out an impact evaluation of a major program funded by an important multilateral donor, which is jargon for someone like the OECD. After 3 years of work, we found statistically significant negative effects of the program on our main response variable. When the time came for the donor to decide whether or not to cancel the program, as I was urging, they chose not to cancel it. And I have to say that the idea then of seeing the evidence and totally ignoring it strikes me as being something that happens quite a lot in the policy circles.
Over to me. Louis, how does this work from your perspective in terms of how do policymakers now get research or information that they need? How do they get answers to questions?
I mean, in some ways that's a win because they at least knew about the research and the evidence, which often policymakers don't. I currently work for CILIP, who represent everybody working in the library sector, but I've worked previously in government think tanks, universities, and for the Publishers Association. So I've kind of seen this problem from a few different angles. I guess the first thing is we should slightly take it easy on ourselves and the other actors in the system. It is really complicated. It's a really big, complicated system. So it's no one person's fault that that best evidence isn't being used. So to play devil's advocate, there's probably a whole other series of things that policymaker has to think about, that funder has to think about, other than just, does this intervention work? They're people, they'll be worried about their careers. If they're a politician, they're worried about their voters. They're worried about the politics within the funder. And just thinking of this kind of ecosystem, I think is quite a useful concept because it helps you realize how messy it is. It's organic, both in terms of it's full of people, and people are messy and organic, but also the connections between us all are very not systematic. It's not a process. Within government in the UK, there is, I can't remember what it's called, but there's a kind of cycle of policy making.
ROMEF.
Thank you, the ROMEF cycle. I can't remember what it all stands for, but Kath will know it off by heart, has a tattoo. But it basically shows these very logical steps of developing policy, evaluating policy. And having worked in 3 different departments, it's total nonsense. At different times, yes, it should work like that. But in reality, with a big kind of messy system of humans, all kinds of things go wrong, and we just have to kind of accept that. So anything we can do to put ourselves in the shoes of the other people in the system, especially the ones we're trying to influence in some direction in this kind of chain or in this system, I think that will make you more effective. So if you're a publisher, librarian, an academic, a policymaker, or somebody in government advising policymakers, really think about those other people in the system. And at the end of the day, you know, the policymaker is probably the most important kind of customer and the kind of supplier, to use this, you know, commercial language that some people don't like, but the supplier is the academic, and everyone else is trying to connect those two in the right way at the right time. Okay, there's some thoughts.
Very good. Thanks. Yeah, I'm slightly going to echo what Lewis just said about, you know, the incentives and so forth. I want to start with a few positives though. I moved over to the think tank world from academia 17 odd years ago. And I've seen many lows in that time in terms of how evidence came into policy making, particularly over the last 6-7 years. But let's not dwell on that. But there are a lot of positives as well. And I spend a lot of time, we work with academics, we train them on how to engage with government better. We work with people inside government on how they can improve policy making. And we even do sessions with ministers, MPs and others. REF and KEF has really changed the picture for academia and the incentives there, and the kind of training that we do to help them engage. And even when they're not supported institutionally and by the incentives of the need to publish, there are huge numbers of academics out there who just want to engage because they're doing the research and they want it to be of value. And that's fantastic and great to applaud. Inside government, there's been a lot of improvements. They have a whole analytical function. Every department has a bunch of analysts whose job is very similar to what academics do. It is constantly reviewing the evidence. It's to be the experts on the evidence, and it's going and doing their own research. And they're constantly engaging with academics and with academic evidence. Similarly, chief scientists, the growth of chief scientists in departments, and they're not just STEM backgrounds. You have scientists who are social scientists, behavioral scientists. Only in the Foreign Office do you really have historians, speaking as a historian, but it's still, they're much more empowered, especially post-COVID. The other thing to say is governments and ministers, and particularly under this government, despite what you might see or your own impressions of the current UK government, in my interactions with them, they are much more interested in evidence base. They want the civil service to be providing its best advice. They don't want policy-based evidence to be presented to them, but they do still hit the problem of the incentives on them. And that brings me to the bad news. The thing that we talk to academics about is, and we get them to do an exercise of this, is Google yourself, and are you and your research on the first page when you Google a plain term kind of introduction to your, you know, what a normal person might type. And if you're not, then you're not going to be found by a policymaker, because a lot of the time they will just be Googling. The churn, I always tell this story. So one of my areas of expertise is sort of institutional memory around Whitehall. And I always tell the story of how every couple of years, a new person allocated in the Cabinet Office to look into institutional memory in Whitehall comes to talk to me. And so I pass on my institutional memory of everything the previous people doing their job did on that topic. So the turnover of people in Whitehall is a problem. Access is a problem. Most policy officials don't have access to any of the journals, you know, and even if it's open access, they probably won't go looking for it unless it's coming up on Google. The analysts might pass it on to them, but most interactions with academic evidence is through the individuals, and that's what's most valuable to them. And then finally, I was going to make that same point about the trade-offs. You know, I remember talking to somebody, this is when we were looking at legal advice, about the different things they were having to think through in a policy, and they listed a whole long number of things that they might go through, of which money is almost always the top, even possibly before the political incentives. And the actual evidence comes much further down the list in terms of it. So it's very much there in the sort of, you know, foregrounding of the policy development, but there are so many other things. And as one new SPAD to government put it to me recently, basically training on government should be about how do you make trade-offs, because everything they're doing is, you know, between one bad choice and another bad choice, and thinking about the consequences of that. So it's not that they don't want to, but it's hard. Sorry, I was a bit longer.
No, that's great, and a great kickoff for the session. Jaron, I don't know whether to look at you up here or on this little screen down here, but over to you. Can you talk us through your perspectives on this process?
Sure, I'd be glad to, and thanks. Sorry that I'm enormous in your room. Is there an echo, or I'm okay?
Sounds good.
All good.
Thank you. Thank you. So from my perspective, I think, you know, what Kath and Louis bring up here are a number of different tensions. And maybe where I want to begin, just from a transition from academia into our more development organization focus within CABI, is that we know academic research is inherently rigorous and it's very time consuming, yet the policymaking cycle and policymakers indeed need to make decisions quickly. So I find that we spend a lot of time thinking about the timing mismatch, right, and the significant challenges faced there. So within the Juno Evidence Alliance, which is a new platform that we've set up designed to support donors, policymakers, and research in the food system, we really focus on trying to think about the synthesis of fragmented, highly technical research finding, because sometimes it's really challenging to know where policymakers in fact should begin. Right, where should we begin this journey? Is it with the researcher that we know the best, that we have a phone call that we can get on a phone call, or is it kind of by reviewing all of the evidence that we can find, Kath, as you say, through Google or through kind of the researchers who are already embedded within think tanks and within governments? It can be really challenging to know where to begin. So, you know, kind of despite, I agree with what Louis says, where the cycle is so incredibly complex. People are messy, the systems are messy, and we're trying to take two messy systems, science and policymaking, and fuse them together, right? And so I do think that process actually is a really important word here. And process is something that we can co-design together in order to sort of take the findings from multiple diverse studies and try to bring them together in coherent, accessible narratives. And those narratives need to be backed by similar rigorous methods, the kind that we find in, you know, individual scientific studies, but we need to think about those methods as something that we can rely on over and over and over again, no matter what the research question is, to bring it together to create synthesis so that we're, again, handing over to policymakers on, you know, quick timelines, fast turnaround, something that looks similar every time. And so in Juno, we rely on the practice of evidence synthesis, right? And that's really taking data from multiple high quality studies, looking for reoccurring themes, and trying to reframe those findings in very clear visual summaries. And so we focus on the practical takeaways to ensure that evidence is directly linked to policy and to action. But in order to do this effectively, and this will be my last point, and I'll come back to the panel, I think thinking about how do we understand the policymaking environment as scientists, as researchers and publishers is really important, because, you know, what we think the pressures are in terms of translation of dense, you know, academic language, that may not actually be the greatest barrier to implementation, right? It could be a whole host of other things. So I think it's important that we think about how do we understand what that policymaking environment looks like. Right. Happy to hand it back over to you, Damien.
We just got a slight audio problem here, Jaron, so we missed the last bit. Are we able to?
Sure.
What that noise is?
Sounds good.
They'll fix it. Sorry?
Headset.
Oh, it's at Jaron's end.
Headset.
Oh, okay.
Is it a headset?
Maybe a headset. I don't know. Yeah. There's just a bit of feedback coming through, Jaron, but we caught 90% of that, I would say. So we'll carry on.
Okay.
Thank you. Oh,
I can take off the headphones if that's all right.
Yeah, that's great. Is that all right? Can you guys hear it? Okay. All right, great. Thank you very much. Kath, I wanted to ask you to pick up something that Jaron was just talking about, or alluding to, I suppose, is and you were talking about a bit, the appetite within policymakers to get this right? You know, how much is this a burning platform, if you like? You know, are they kind of crying out for this, or would they rather just call up Jaren, as she was saying, and ask for the answer? Are they quite happy with that model? How would you kind of characterize it?
I don't think I'd say anyone's happy with the model. I mean, you've got a time when, you know, government's going through a spending review, which is involving all departments basically doing a zero-based review of can everyone justify what they're doing. The more they can find efficiencies, the better. The issue is, as Jaren was just saying, I mean, it's time. You don't have the time to spend sort of fixing it on it. So if somebody comes up with a systems-based solution, then great. But I think some of it is, you know, as Louis was saying, just what people are like. People are messy. You're never going to get a sort of perfect version of this. But there definitely is the desire for policy to be evidence-based. You know, ministers want pilots that show that the thing they're spending the money on is going to work, is going to make a difference. You know, you've got a big push in our criminal justice system on looking at what works in terms of, you know, prisoner rehabilitation, reducing the prison estate. You know, there's so many issues where obviously the incentives are there for the best evidence to tell you what to do. That said, the frustrations are there in ministers as well, because, you know, if you get one who's been around for a while, they'll sort of find that, you know, the same issues are coming round and round again. And I've had ministers say that, you know, they talked about the policy and, you know, talked about what evidence they could go into it. And the Civil Service commissioned a piece of research and it was presented to the minister and they said, hang on, didn't we commission that 18 months ago? What happened to that one? So the departments don't even have a good record of what research they're commissioning, let alone that evidence synthesis of what's out there. But technology is making a difference. This spending review, the Treasury have introduced sort of basically shared evidence base between departments. So trying to make sure that when you've got cross-cutting thematic issues, departments are both moving from the same evidence base. There's a greater push towards dashboards, so more real-time information, better sharing of administrative data across systems, and obviously AI is a key tool to that. So it's a great opportunity to use AI for evidence synthesis, as long as we're putting in the right, you know, algorithms to make sure that we can trust and we're using it in ways that are actually effective and help and don't just confuse the picture further. But it still does come down to those political incentives. You know, ultimately, look at social care. There is plenty of evidence out there about the problems of social care, about the long-term savings that you could make if you had a more preventative approach to social care. But that involves a huge amount of money up front that at the moment means cutting a load of other policies. So that's a political question. Yes, there's evidence to say do this in this policy, but that means all these other policies falling over. So what does your evidence say about the trade-offs between spending on this group of people versus spending on that group of people? And that doesn't come down to evidence, it comes down to politics.
Yeah, okay, thank you. We'll come back to the AI technology point, because that's a really important one. But Toby, maybe you could give a few more perspectives. I'm particularly interested in the pressures that the policymakers are under and the speed with which they need information and to make informed decisions and so on. Do you have some views on the process for getting there and resolving that?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, I'm thinking back to when I was at the OECD, seeing how the OECD fed into the policymaking world. One of the most important conduits was the Secretary General of the OECD visiting ministers with printed reports in his hand, which he would hand over to ministers with a little, the reason why you need to read this report is because, and then he would put it in the local context. And of course, the minister was never going to read the report, but the minister hands it to one of his advisors, and you can be pretty sure that that report would be turned into a 2-page brief for the minister the following day. But this was probably the most effective way for the OECD to get its messages across to ministers. It wasn't a website, it wasn't social media, it was face-to-face handing over printed reports. Because you can't hand over something that's digital. You can't hand over a thumb drive, it doesn't have the same impact. So that was, you know, a big piece of the puzzle. The other thing is the other thing I learned from the OECD is how countries are in competition with one another, and one of the big things the OECD does is it compares performance in different policy areas from one country to another country. And countries tend to have an idea for where they're really good. So, for example, in Germany, they thought they were the top in education. Now, some of you may have heard of the PISA program as a program for international student assessment. When the very first PISA report came out, the German government nearly fell because Germany was not top. They were actually like mid-table, which was an enormous shock to the German system because they all thought that they had the best education system in the world. There's another example where France, obviously they think they're terribly well read, there was a literacy survey and France did not come top. And the French were so upset that they actually left the report, so they weren't in it, which actually blew up in their faces because then the media said, well, why aren't we in this report? And so the OC said, well, you took your toys off the table. And so the French ministers got into even more trouble because they weren't in the report. But it goes to show how the policymakers worry about what's going on next door, and am I top and am I bottom and so on. This competition is really quite important from one country to another country. However, I will also say that the countries are really bad from learning from each other. So you take homelessness. Finland has solved homelessness. They have a process called Housing First, and they basically have no homeless people in Finland. So why are there homeless people in London? And why are there homeless people in New York? Because they're not looking for the examples of what works. That could be the funding, that they don't want to move the funding. Or I think a lot of it's just down to ignorance. They don't want to look at what works in another country. And also it could be down to politics because, well, we can't possibly build houses for people because people should stand on their own 2 feet. But whatever it is, the answers are out there, but often you have to look into a different country. And usually people are really bad at looking at other countries. I mean, they look at the league tables, but in terms of the detailed policy, people are really bad at that, which is something, particularly when you work at the OEC, is very depressing because the answers are there, but they're not being read. It's really frustrating.
Louis, anything to add to this?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of concepts might be useful. So, you know, we're at the researcher to reader concept, and there's sessions about policymakers, which we've mainly talked about, but also practitioners. And I talked about trying to put ourselves in the shoes of that end reader and their world as much as possible, wherever we are in the kind of chain, in the ecosystem. And one of the concepts which I found quite useful when I was inside government is the idea of demand-led, so demand for evidence. And that that's the easiest way to think about it, because basically you're looking for a policymaker at a given moment who has a research question that they need answering now with the best available answer. And if you can kind of position yourself to be ready to respond at that point, that is a really good point of impact. There is a different way of thinking about it where you try and like influence their entire like frame of reference and the questions they ask, but that is really hard and much more political. But I think just having in your head that kind of demand-led approach, you know, what are the research questions? And alongside all the other kind of encouraging recent features that have been put into the UK government, alongside chief scientific advisors, what work centres, things like that, is an innovation called areas of research interest. And this is the idea that each government body, each government department will publish a list of research questions they have. Now, even inside government, they are not kind of universally accepted or used or understood, even within a department. But it's a pretty good indicator of at least what the scientist and the analytical profession in that department thinks is a good question. So I think getting into that kind of responsive frame of mind, what's a demand-led thing, that can be quite useful. And then the second one I just mentioned is, you know, there's obviously the personal politics of the researcher and everybody else involved in the chain, as well as the politics of the government of the day and the policymaker. And sometimes they marry perfectly, and that feels great. You can be an ally, you can be a trusted ally. at different times that feels deeply uncomfortable. In which case, you can feel as a researcher, your role is not actually to be an ally, but to be a kind of campaigner trying to change the government's mind or even change the government. And there is a kind of halfway house as a critical friend, where you're not completely kind of co-opted with one current government, and you're not completely up against everything, but you have that kind of relying on your professional research kind of function to have that level of independence to be the critical friend. So, and you can change between those different modes at different times. So there are a couple of kind of concepts which I think can be helpful if you're kind of looking at the policymaker, looking at the teacher or the nurse, and just thinking, why are these people not reading my excellent research? So yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to go to Jan, and then I'll come to you after I've gone to Jan. Jan, I just wanted to ask you about that because Louis, you were just talking about the importance of connecting up the questions that policymakers have with the research and the evidence that's being produced. And I know that's something that Juno deals with every day. Can you say a bit about that process and how you can connect up what the policymakers want and what's coming out of the research and evidence community?
Sure. No, thanks, Damien. Is the feedback a little bit better in the room?
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, all good. Thank you.
Thank you. So to connect both with what Toby and Louis have just mentioned, I think, where countries may not want to learn from each other, I think it's a good reminder that evidence is not only technical, but it's also cultural, right, and sociocultural. And so I think it's good for us to think about that from kind of a researcher and a publishing perspective, because we also need our work to be interdisciplinary in nature. And so addressing a problem, so if I'm coming from the food systems world, so maybe not addressing problems directly from what their technical perspective is, but some of their either trade-offs or the underlying issues is often a good way into the problem. So if I think about some of the issues we face in food systems, gender is a really important topic, and that's because women comprise more than 40% of the agricultural workforce across the world. And yet women often control fewer resources, and they may lack access to good land, to good soil, finance, credit, things like that. So even though we want to be able to better understand how we improve soil health, for instance, depending on the context and depending on kind of the policymaking arena, it may actually be better to come at this issue to say, well, even though we want to increase overall agriculture productivity, it may come from addressing it from the perspective of, well, what are the women in the system? What do they need to have access to? And I feel like that's a way of trying to connect up what the actual, policies and priorities may be in any given system with trying to also, internalize and synthesize much of that evidence base. So when we think about connecting up, the technical question with what the policymaking priorities are, we look at it as part of a really coordinated and big picture system. So despite the fact that we know that we need to increase overall productivity of food, potentially directly addressing that question may not be the way in, but it may be in through kind of a different policy priority, such as gender. Oh, back to you, Damien.
Thanks very much, Jan. That's great. Yeah, happy to open it up to the floor. Are there any questions or comments so far?
Right next to you.
Anthony?
This is a question. This is not a question, it's a comment. I thought it was an incredibly good session. All I want to say is
We're only halfway. We're only halfway.
The skills coming through was just astonishing.
Thank you very much, Anthony. That's great. Any other questions or comments so far? No. Okay, I'll come back to you though, so if you think of something. Toby, maybe we can start thinking a bit about where we go next and what solutions might look like. Kathy, you mentioned some earlier. Where would you say publishers can help with this process? What's their role?
Okay, so if I think about publishers and they're representing the scientists and you're producing journal articles, what's the route to get to a policymaker's ear? Because they're not going to read the journal article, or very rare they'll read the journal article. So either you're going to distill it into some other form, which is difficult and expensive, but I would suggest there's another route, and that is to look at the networks that inform that policymaker. So which think tanks do they listen to? Which NGOs do they listen to? And maybe you should feed the journal article to the researchers who work in those think tanks or work in those NGOs, so that the research can be distilled by those intermediaries, which are trusted intermediaries by the policymaker, and the policymaker then may actually listen to what you have to say. One of the things that in these sort of sessions, it always frustrates me. Everyone thinks that all research is in journals. You've got about half of the research. The other research all comes out as grey literature and is produced by NGOs and think tanks and research centers outside of academia. There is a mountain of research coming out, and you're competing for eyeballs with those outputs. You're not competing journal to journal, you're also competing against the reports. So unless you take those into your thinking, you're only looking at half the problem. So maybe you should be thinking about how you get the journals into the hands of NGOs and IGOs and think tanks, bearing in mind that they don't buy subscriptions, and bearing in mind that a lot of the NGOs that I talk to, they've given up looking at journal articles because journals are too slow. The research is too old. And therefore, they're actually looking for much more current content. They're looking for preprints, and they're looking for reports that come from other NGOs and think tanks.
Thank you. Louis, maybe from a library's perspective, you could comment on that and how to improve this process. But I'm also interested in your views. Maybe this is two questions, sorry. It does seem to be a bit based in serendipity, you know, in terms of who you know, which think tank you've had an email from, you know, any of that kind of stuff, which is, I hope, partly relevant to the library point as well. Thanks.
I guess from a library perspective, probably focusing on higher education libraries, but every government department, every parliament has a library service as well, servicing its members. So from a library perspective, you're kind of in a support role alongside lots of other people. I think we maybe put too much pressure and expectation on academics these days to be an amazing teacher, an amazing researcher, amazing at knowledge exchange. I think there's very few individuals who can do all of those three things amazingly well, but they're not on their own. It's on their institution to provide the support around them to help with that. So yes, that absolutely is about librarians and library services. It also includes people who are roughly called knowledge brokers. Increasingly, you get universities who've got kind of policy centres with various names. I know Kath used to work at one at Mile End, and they're cropping up all the time. And that's just the idea that you've got some people in the university who are not just thinking about citations, they're thinking about policy and practitioner impact, and they're trying to educate, support, and kind of help their academic colleagues to have that kind of impact. So yeah, so I'd say there are support services around academics. I think publishers could do a lot more. I think some really interesting examples from individual publishers, and I've helped a couple in the past think about that kind of problem, but I just feel like there's a lot of innovation and capacity within the publishing world that could really turn its attention to the question of impact. In the same way it's turned its attention to the question of citations. I think there's a lot of scope there. And I should also add, there's lots of great tools out there. There's one called Overton, there's Policy Commons that Toby runs, and these are quite interesting, new, exciting technological approaches. You've got the Academy at the IFG that does really good training approaches for academics, for politicians. Nice. So it does feel like there's a growing ecosystem of support around the individual academic. And in terms of, is it just serendipity? There's always an element of that, but like all good luck, you kind of make your own luck to get yourself into that position. So, you know, have you got your 30-second pitch? Can you use plain English about your research? Are you in the right types of rooms where you might walk into the right elevator with the policymaker? You know, all of these things are steps you can take. But even then, you might not get that conversation, you might not have interaction, but there's a lot of activity that you can do, preparation and research, which will help you increase your chance of having that impact.
Great, thank you. Kath?
Shall I give the think tank perspective?
Yeah.
So most research projects that we do, and these might be, you know, a big chunky piece of work, might be 6 to 9 months, maybe a year's worth of work, some of the sort of rolling research projects, but they always start with a literature review. And we always believe very strongly that understanding the best academic literature out there is fundamental to that. But we don't have an institutional subscription to anything. I'm a member of the London Library. I have access to JSTOR. It's an absolute nightmare. The search function of some of these aren't great. Google Scholar, I think we probably find more helpful. But even so, you then get into abstracts. I have to say, a lot of the websites, when you do get onto one of the publishers, you end up in this sort of doom loop of trying to find a way to sort of get access. I'm very happy if anyone wants to follow up on specifics. But it's not made easy for us. And we cite stuff. You know, we want to give credit. We want to point to the best research out there. We want to make sure that what we're doing is sort of good. The other impediment, though, is just academic writing style. And I say this as somebody who learned through think tanks much better ways of writing clearly and succinctly. I had to review an academic proposal recently, which was basically having realized that long monographs are not the way to engage with policymakers. We're going to write a series of shorter books, but still books, in order to teach policymakers about X, Y, Z. We produce charts. All of our quant research, and we do a lot of primary research ourselves, it is always thinking about what is the best chart to visualize this specific point, or a series of charts to do that. We spend a lot of time thinking about the visualization of data. My mic's not.
Testing.
Think maybe I'll turn it off. No, I'm back.
Okay.
Back. I would recommend to have a look. We've got a publication coming out shortly, or you can look back at past copies called Performance Tracker. So we do data analysis of the performance metrics coming out of a variety of different public services. We do that because, shockingly, government doesn't do it itself. And so we are the only ones providing that. We're about to do a new piece of work where we're looking at it at a local level. So we're going to be answering questions about, you know, the range of behaviour between individual GP surgeries or NHS trusts, looking at different prisons, which ones have strong prisoner rehabilitation programmes and which ones have high prisoner reoffending rates and or prisoner violence, and what is the correlation between that? Can we see correlation, you know, or let alone causation? So we do a lot of our own data work, and then we do present it, we do use the written word, but again, have a look at the way in which we think about, okay, what are the conclusions? We are directly communicating to policymakers. So yeah, the long form article is not, and I completely agree with you on the handing something physically to the minister, but please don't send stuff to ministers' inboxes, because everyone does that. Yeah. You know, your best way to engage with them is the elevator pitch. It is networking, and it is making stuff as accessible as possible and findable as possible, which we all know, we've all been talking about it. So, sorry, I don't mean that to sound a downer. What I mean to say is there is a lively and willing audience out there. But I think still that sort of learning back from the think tank world to academia, it's changed a lot in the 17 years that I've worked in it, but it still frustrates me that there isn't more of a learning coming across from it. The policy institutes are really starting to sort of make a difference, I think.
If I just say that the OECD, our most successful publication output was a 2-page spread. On the left-hand side, you have an explanation of the charts and graphs that are on the right-hand side.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
And that was the most effective way of communicating to everybody, not just policymakers, but to the public as well. So something that's easy to read, that interprets the chart that's on the other side. That's it. It's the most successful publication form that we developed at the OECD.
Okay. So this output, different kinds of output that researchers can produce and publishers can obviously support and facilitate, is a really important point. I'll go to Jan in a second, but Louis, did you want
just
to add?
two very quick ones? I mean, think about it in terms of social media. Politicians certainly do. You know, one picture, 220 characters or whatever it is on your chosen platform. It's helpful, and not as the academic, certainly not when you're doing the research, but some of those people around them in the ecosystem can help them do that translation. And are libraries going to be included in your analysis of that report?
Yeah, good question.
I'll go to Jan while you write that out. Jan, do you have anything to add to this? Because this kind of the different forms of output from research and how policymakers then engage with that is clearly crucial.
It is. I'll be brief. I do think that creating those feedback loops between the researchers and the policymakers is really crucial. And just to kind of give a thumbs up to what Kath is saying, for me, NGOs and think tanks are some of my best partners. So I learned to be a reformed academic by basically just creating relationships with NGOs that were interested in the same subjects that I were. And it was such an informal process in order to basically just get a listserv digest of interesting things coming from a think tank, reaching out and saying, I think my research might align with what you do, going there, giving a seminar, giving a presentation, just to create a human connection with them. And from there, I think it's turned into a lifelong kind of partnership and friendship, because I can sort of help them connect to academic research, connect to academics, help them read through the lines. But on the flip side, they're my best partners because they're thinking about policy priorities and really helping me rethink what is it that we need to take from the academic research and make it policy relevant and make it policy ready. And all of the different outputs that Toby and Kath and Louis are speaking to, I think are incredibly important. But for me, the first step was just figuring out, how do I exist in a different ecosystem, and how do I create those, how do I have those collaborations? And what can we do together that's better than on our own? So, I try to think of myself in some ways as a reformed academic, but in the best sense, because that exchange really helps to tailor the policy outputs to real world needs and kind of continually, improve the impact. But Damien, I'm not sure if you have, I'm having a little trouble hearing in the room. I don't know if we've gone to kind of the role of publishers as vital intermediaries yet, or if that's coming. So I'll pause here.
Yeah, no, that'd be great, Jan. Please go ahead if you have comments on that.
No, just to pick up, I think I heard this in the room, but I am curious to hear more from folks in this room about the role of policy as publishers as those intermediaries, because I think, not only the role of peer review continues to be really strong when we're trying to bring together, policy relevant insights with academic insights, but how are we doing innovative things that maybe go beyond open access in ensuring that high quality research is accessible, it's relevant, and it's ready to inform decision making. So I'm hopeful to learn from folks in this room what maybe some of the new innovations are coming from the publishing world.
Great, thank you. That's a good opportunity to open it up. Are there any questions or comments? Phil, I think you were first towards the back.
Hi, Phil Jones from Moor Branch Cooperative. So certainly the beginning of this panel, it all seemed a bit bleak, didn't it? I mean, we started off with,
We got more bleak.
Policymakers don't know the literature and then don't bother acting on it, and then we had, well, no, it's worse than that. They don't even know it exists. So it was, but the more I hear about it, the more I feel like there's just something perhaps missing in the process. There's a layer that isn't being acted upon. So researchers produce research and they write it for other researchers, or sometimes they write it for peer reviewers in order to get it published. And then that's an activity that happens within academia. And then industry is often quite good at taking those ideas and moving it on to the next step and turning it into drugs or turning it into engineering or whatever that happens to be. But there seems to be that step that turns academic findings into something that policymakers can understand is accessible to them, is sort of missing. And I wonder, what does the panel think? Who should be doing that? I don't think it should be academics at all, because they're doing what they're trained to do, which is academic research. So And it seems that the civil service perhaps might be the people to do it, but they don't do it. So who should be doing it?
Kath.
Look, I think it's more of a whole ecosystem. And I mean, you slightly touched on it there, that we always think of it as just academia and government when we're talking about policy making. You're right to raise industry, and there's all sorts of other audiences as well. Even within the policy making sphere, it is, you know, policy making happens in charities, in businesses. You know, it's not just all happening in Whitehall or Westminster, or indeed around devolved governments and elsewhere. I do agree with you that this idea that we've got to, that academics, you need to be both pure researchers and also, you know, have the skill set to translate and to turn it into policy and so forth. It works for some policy areas, but it shouldn't be true of all. I think academics themselves or universities are starting to think about that a bit more in terms of translation. I'm a bit wary about the just dump it all on the civil service. Obviously, it is core to their job that they've been asked to look into a policy problem, and they should go out and look at the range of evidence that's out there on it. But it goes back to my points about how easy that is to access and engage and so forth. There are a lot of civil servants who are very busy. And remember, we're talking about 20,000 people at the core. The vast majority of civil servants are out there delivering policy and coming up with their own evidence about what works and so forth. So actually, the core number of people that you're talking about who might be doing some kind of policy thinking, it's a much smaller number than you think it is, because even the policy makers within Whitehall, that 20,000, a lot of them are administrators overseeing existing policy. There's very few of them that are actually just sitting there thinking big thoughts and going away and doing some research and so forth. And it tends to sort of get more junior down the levels. So yes, I do agree that it's a systemic problem that, you know, perhaps the answer is that ultimately we want AI to do this, you know, if it's about synthesizing or, you know, making clearer the research, you get all of the human problems that we've talked about. But it isn't, I don't think it is as easy as just saying, oh, academia, you know, should, despite all my points earlier on, and I should say I was told to be provocative, but I don't think you should put it all on academia, but I also don't think you should put it all on governments, that why can't they just access this and, you know, make it sort of easier for them and stuff. Yeah. It's not, but it is like, sorry, it is still very frustrating for me just how much of this industry has grown up in order to facilitate peer review as a means for, you know, academic advancement. It was never designed as a system of getting evidence and information out into the world. It was always something that was much more inward looking to academia, and those of us that didn't enjoy it went elsewhere, I'm afraid.
Yeah, that is absolutely the crux of it. Thank you. Louis.
It is a good example to talk about business as another type of practitioner. And I think policymaking can probably learn something from that system. I would say slightly that policymakers, policy tends to be a more complicated set of problems. They have more things to think about. If I think of one example, when I was in the Cabinet Office, we did some work for the Home Office, trying to work out whether people with autism spectrum condition are more likely to be involved in terrorism. We got all the world-leading experts. They told us what the latest thinking across the world was on that topic, and there was no conclusive answer. It's just a really complicated question. And I'm sure there are some business problems which are similarly complicated, but I think they don't have the wide range of considerations that policy has to think of in terms of value for money and legality and limited resources and all these other things. So I do think often we give policymakers a slightly too hard a time just because they do have to tackle with the most difficult questions.
Thank you. Thanks for your question, Phil. Gentleman in front of Phil. Yeah, thanks. I'm just going to, everything will be based on where you are, Phil. So that's it. That'll now officially be my name for the rest of it. I am gentleman in front of Phil, so known as Dan. I'm at PLOS. It's kind of just building on that. It's an interesting piece because actually some of what you were saying about the realities of how it works is, you know, sorry, not to
reduce it too much, but a graph with 240 characters, that's recreating the problem of sexy science, but in a different context. And from everything you're saying, it is obviously very complicated. So it's kind of a question of, I feel like we're back at the beginning of everyone pointing their finger at someone else. We're in academics, publishers saying it's a policymaker thing. Policymakers are trying to point elsewhere. So is this just a not fit for purpose? There's an as yet unidentified third role that is joining the dots, because also it's surely incredibly context specific that translating academic research into policy from a UK perspective is irreparably different from a US, from a Chinese. So is there actually an argument here for a third party? I mean, you mentioned AI, but it's always a bit of a black box. But is there just a fundamentally missing player in the game here?
Jan, can I ask for your comments on that? Do you think there's a missing piece in this chain that needs to be brought in?
I don't know if I'd say it's a missing piece, but I think we do have missing handshakes, right? So at every point along the ecosystem, and I think we opened up the conversation talking about this, there are so many different actors in place, but I don't know that we have efficient either feedback mechanisms or handoff mechanisms. Maybe Kath or Louis, I don't know if you have thoughts on that as well from where you're sitting. Within our own ecosystem of evidence synthesis, we try to focus very much on ensuring that the researchers have the training and the capacity to do the evidence synthesis, which is a highly technical process. We have liaisons that work closely with different, policymakers, in this case, really donors, to better understand policy priorities. And then we have NGOs that we work with as well to better communicate the information, as well as, get policy priorities. So I think just within our own little ecosystem, we do struggle with making sure we have enough capacity for all of those handshakes to take place. And I think that the same is true within all organizations. There's not always enough time or resource to make sure that we're collaborating with whoever else is in our networks. But I'd be curious for others' perspective on that as well.
Great, thanks, Jane. Kath?
Yeah, just quickly on that point. It's first worth a caveat on this. I often think philosophically of like, is there, we are striving for more effective government. What does that look like? Is there such a thing as perfect government? Will everyone finally be satisfied and say, right, yeah, we've licked it. Well done, everyone. Let's all just enjoy that brief millisecond of a moment. It's not going to happen. There's always going to be higher expectations around it. But, in terms of what we are talking about today, we in the think tank world aren't doing it, and we're still frustrated we don't get as much impact as we want to, or this issue isn't being tackled, or somebody's not listening to us about that, but you keep plugging away at it. I don't think it's fair to say, I'm not saying that we boil down really complex issues into a sort of nifty chart. It's not that. There is a lot of internal rigor and peer review about the quality of, every sentence we put out, every chart that we put out, does it say? So we're very specific about it, but it's more that we break down the issues and try and think about how to actually, we also think about what is the learning approach of policymakers. I mean, that's basically what I do day to day. In the academy, is think about communicating information depending on how people learn and the context in which they're coming to it. So we are using information to help people learn and have impact, and that we're much more focused on that. And I fully appreciate that the incentives for all of you, the incentives for academia are also much more complex than that. But yeah, I'll stop because I'll keep going. I could rant about this forever. I love this topic, by the way. But we will never fix it. And if we did fix it, then what would we all do?
That's great. Thank you. Toby, anything to add?
Yeah, I'm just sort of reflecting on, some case studies. Sometimes I see a story in a newspaper about a new study that's come out from a university. And I think, oh, that's interesting. And of course, being a story in a newspaper, there's no citation. So it'll say a study from University of X, and it might mention the professor's name. And I want to read that paper. So I go to the university website. What's the chances I'm going to find that paper? It's close to zero. Sometimes because the paper hasn't actually come out yet, because the press office has released the story before the paper's been published, but mainly because university websites are all about come and study works. If you go on a university website, it's all about their student programs. You try and find their research. You try and find the articles they've published. They're almost impossible to find. And I end up often trying to track down the professor, and I email the professor and I say, well, where is this thing published? Because the journey to that piece of research is terrible. And in terms of who's not in this room and who's not playing their part, and that's the universities. University websites are terrible at finding information. And yet the one thing they do is produce information. Really weird. And you would have thought they'd actually be really, really good at helping people find the research that comes out from their institutions, but they're not. It's one of the worst places to go and find information is the university website. And if there's one actor that ought to up their game, it's the universities. They should be supporting, putting more press work out there. They should be putting their information in a sensible, searchable place, not a repository because they're impossible to do, but a website that is actually human friendly. It is terrible. I'll stop that.
Yeah. So you're on the fence.
Yeah.
Louis.
Just briefly, I mean, if it's an information problem, you've got a profession that spent many, many years dedicated to solving those problems, and they are already in all these institutions. They're just often underfunded, I would say. So in terms of Phil's question about what's missing, for me, the two biggest kind of units are government and universities. And you've got librarians and other information professionals in both. We've talked about lots of other kind of third parties that can help make those two kind of boundaries a bit more porous. But I think, yeah, librarians have got the skills you need to get to handle information. Yeah.
Thank you. I have an eye on time, Mark, I promise.
So do
we have time for more questions? I think so. Where should we go? Lady in the white shirt, to the west of Phil. I don't know if it's west.
Is it me?
Oh, two white shirts.
Lady with the hat and the,
Got the mic.
yeah, that's right.
Thank you, it's Bernie Poland from Erasmus. This is a challenge, I think, and I know that the session's about to end, but I think it's relevant to the whole conference and all of the publishers here. And I've just put this on Blue Sky. At every academic conference, I find myself thinking, why does a journal article still persist as such a key way to communicate research? There's books too, also. Because listening to you all today, and it's been such a useful session, I'm just wondering, who does that serve? The article structure, the journal structure. Apart from those, it obviously serves. It doesn't seem to be working well for making things happen and better in the world. So it's just always comes up. So it's a kind of question for publishers, I suppose, as well as universities or institutions. Why are we still so stuck on this model? And I've got theories, but I just want us all to think about that because it is anachronistic, in my opinion.
Toby.
I'll give you an example. Some of you may have heard of the Potsdam Climate Institute in Germany. One of the leading climate research centers. And last year, for the first time, they put out a piece of new research, not in a journal. And they made a big fuss about it. Why? Because they wanted that research to be accessible to the public. So they put it out as a report. And it was full of color and it was accessible and all the rest of it. They did not publish it in a journal. It's the first time I've seen a major research institute turn their back on journals and to publish new research as a report. And I think that could be maybe the beginning of a trend, because if someone like Potsdam is turning their backs on journals, maybe others will as well.
Thank you. Jan, before we wrap up, any final comments from you?
So maybe just on that last and very provocative point, I still believe that there is, especially in the era of AI, there really is an important role for journals and peer review to play. I don't know that the journals look and feel exactly like what they do now, but I will say, and I'm getting ready, I'm going to say goodbye in a minute. I'm presenting to the G7 this morning, or where we are in the G7. But that's a different topic. However, I still do get a lot of questions from policymakers to say, has this been peer reviewed? Can you tell me about the veracity process behind this? And so that's something that I think we should reflect on, even though there's issues within the system that do need to change, that do need to be updated. There is still an opportunity for us to think about what's our own reflection, what does our peer review process look like, and is that part of what makes science so valuable to policymakers? So I think, I'm a big fan of revising structures rather than throwing structures out, but something to reflect on. And Damien, if it's all right, I am going to just say a quick goodbye and a huge thank you for participating in this session, and wishing everyone a great rest of your day and a good lunch as well. So we'll see.
Thanks very much,
So
Jan. That's
can
great.
I just on the peer review? It's always a trigger point for me. Journals are peer reviewed. How many articles were retracted last year? And secondly, most grey literature is peer reviewed. So most research that comes out of Institute for Government and other think tanks goes through a form of peer review. It's different from the journal peer review, but most of it is peer reviewed.
Yeah, but it's my colleague.
And why can you trust it? Because the logo of the institute is on the cover. If you trust that logo, you can trust the research. And another question I have for universities, why don't you put your logos on the papers that your scientists publish? Why aren't you putting your trust mark on those papers?
Thank you. On that note, and because Jaren's already gone, thank you very much. I think plenty of food for thought. I think we've run out of time for more wrapping up, but I think we could keep talking for quite a while probably. Thank you for your questions, and thanks especially to the panel. Much appreciated.